We have shared the incommunicable experience of war. We have felt, we still feel, the passion of life to its top. In our youths our hearts were touched with fire. Oliver Wendell Holmes. In 1854, most Americans lived peaceably in towns and cities on the coast, to farms and communities stretching ever westward. War and crisis had not fallen upon the infant Union of American states since the far-off Mexican-American War of 1846. And yet even in a time of peace, the original sin of the American Union sat heavy upon our collective soul, a festering wound of brutality and bondage. At the Constitutional Convention, James Madison already noticed that the real difference of interests lay between northern and southern states, with the institution of slavery and its consequences forming the line of demarcation. The fuse of catastrophe was lit at the birth of a nation conceived in freedom while holding an entire people in chains. By 1854, slavery had been reborn in the South with Eli Whitney's cotton engine, or gin. Where once a slave could clean only 1 pound of cotton a day, now they could clean 50. The two halves of American life, that of the freemen of the North and the slaveholders of the South, were at each other's throats. The battle of the moral heart of the nation was coming to a head. Vermont Senator William Upham, an anti-slavery Northerner, introduced a petition against the expansion of slavery, described as a crime against humanity and a sore evil in the body politic. While on the other side of the conflict, Mississippi Senator and future President of the Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis, claimed the institution of slavery was a blessing which had brought Africans into a Christian land, where civilization would elevate and dignify them. These two great forces in American politics would soon descend upon the quiet fields of Kansas. With the adoption of the Missouri Compromise in 1820, limiting slavery to states south of the Mason-Dixon line and the Ohio River, and the Compromise of 1850, admitting California as a free state and banning the slave trade in the nation's capital, as well as facilitating the passage of the infamous Fugitive Slave Act, which commanded U.S. citizens to return slaves to their masters, even if they made it north. A flimsy bandage had been placed over the gaping wound of slavery in America. That bandage would be ripped apart by Senator Stephen A. Douglas, a Democratic senator from Illinois, firmly committed to westward expansion. Douglas saw the divisive issue of slavery as only a hindrance to American expansion. Douglas's solution to the political strife was the implementation of popular sovereignty in the Kansas and Nebraska territories. The morality of democracy, according to Douglas, lay not in any particular result, but in the process of decision-making itself. Kansas was to be governed by the will of the people, but different people had very different visions for its future. Anti-slavery papers around the country published articles decrying the Kansas-Nebraska Act as evidence of a grand conspiracy of slave-owner power. An article published in the National Era encouraged Northerners to call loudly upon all true patriots to forgo past political differences and unite as a band of brother freemen in defense of our own rights and the rights of human nature. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was signed into law by President Franklin Pierce on May 30, 1854. The race to conquer Kansas for slavery or freedom began in earnest. Northerners were furious with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Before the midterm elections of 1854, Northern Democrats held 91 congressional seats. Afterward, they held only 25. Out of this legislative disaster, the Republican Party was born. Between 1845 and 1856, party branches sprang up across northern states. Conceived as a measure to strengthen the Democratic Party, the Kansas-Nebraska Act created a dangerous rival. Emigration aid societies formed to help in shifting populations westward. The New England Emigrant Aid Company promoted the westward migration of Northerners in order to win the Kansas race for the anti-slavery cause. The company settled towns and outposts populated largely by northern migrants alongside runaway slaves. Among these settlements was the town of Lawrence, named for the company's benefactor. The NEEAC's founding document's stated purpose was to combat slavery by extending the area of freedom by creating new free states as a cordon from the Sons of Liberty to the Gulf of Mexico. One of the greatest proponents of emigration to Kansas was the abolitionist and early feminist Clarina Nichols. Nichols appealed to the women of New England for aid by drawing on their societal role at the time as mothers and caregivers.
Look upon your infants, smiling in the security and sunshine of homes, running over with comfort and happiness and plenty. And from your stores give to those who have none of all these, but the mother love, which in the absence of every means to succor and save, is crushing the overtaxed heart into the blackness of despair.
Heeding the cry of abolitionists like Clarina Nichols, hundreds and thousands of Northerners flocked to the new territory, and they arrived under no illusion of what kind of resistance they would find there.
I wore a cloak, placed the 25-pound of shot on my arm under the cloak, took a bandbox in my hand. Someone made as if to take my box. In my best mood, I politely told them it contained a lady's bonnet. They acted ashamed, and we were no further molested.
Pro-slavery Southerners were quick to respond to the growing threat of abolitionists and Negro thieves. Having dealt with groups like the Iowa Applemen liberating slaves from their masters, Missourians took this new threat seriously. The Platte County Self-Defense Association was founded to ensure Kansas became a slave state by any means necessary. We find these miscalled emigrants really Negro thieves, their purpose not to procure a home in Kansas, but to drive slaveholders therefrom. Missouri vanquished, Arkansas and Texas are looked upon as easy victims. They rejoice in the contemplation of an early exhibition of another Haitian liberation. With the first territorial elections in Kansas's history stolen by Missourian border ruffians, inflating the voting numbers from an eligible population of 2,905 to over 6,000 ballots cast, Free State Northerners in the NEEAC towns of Topeka and Lawrence, home of the anti-slavery paper The Herald of Freedom, and the fortress-like Free State Hotel, came together to form their own government in Topeka in resistance to the pro-slavery legislature of the official Lecompton government. Tensions remained high as Governor Shannon refused to act against Topeka, but in the same moment condemned them. Violence briefly flared after the murder of Free State settler Charles Dow by pro-slavery settler Franklin Coleman. Sheriff Samuel Jones arrested Jacob Branson, the man who owned the land Dow had been living on, after he retaliated against pro-slavery neighbors. When Jones went to arrest the co-conspirators, however, he was met with uncooperative townsfolk and armed Free Staters. Jones proceeded to rally pro-slavery militias and instigate a siege of Lawrence. The brief Wakarusa War claimed no lives, but set a precedent of tit-for-tat reactions. The bleeding of Kansas truly began with the sack of Lawrence. The sack came when Sheriff Jones returned to Lawrence with federal troops to enforce a warrant for the arrest of notable anti-slavery leaders, including Lois Brown and Margaret Wood. The people of Lawrence reluctantly submitted in the presence of federal troops. However, late at night, an unknown gunman snuck into the sheriff's tent and shot him once in the back with a handgun. Enraged, the pro-slavery militias that had come to Samuel Jones's aid during the Wakarusa War returned with a vengeance. The Herald of Freedom printing press was thrown into the Kansas River. The home of the paper's editors burnt to the ground. The 700 pro-slavery men fired cannon and gunpowder kegs on the Free State Hotel. It eventually burnt the building. Only one man was killed in the sack, a pro-slavery man who had been struck by debris from the Free State Hotel. From the bluff overlooking the town called Mount O'Reed, pro-slavery men from South Carolina were heard to yell, "Hurrah for South Carolina! Down with the abolitionists! Slavery in Kansas, by God!"